Today, we see women willingly marrying themselves or four at a time in the name of culture, and not a single women's organization talks about it.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I understand the first session was absolutely fabulous and a natural segue to what we're going to be doing today in session number 2. So the question was posed at the end of the first session, why isn't the media covering more good stories? And so one question that we'll add to the list of things that we'll think about in this session is whether or not women leaders in the media industry might influence the direction of good stories, good reporting about social change in a positive way. In the context of today's global symposium, this leadership is a key issue, and we all know that leadership is both an ambitious and an ambiguous term. What we can all agree is that we seek it, we want it, we desire it, and that somehow it's yet difficult to define. We know it when we see it, but we don't often know how to describe it. As Provost at Barnard, I have the responsibility to build a curriculum that helps to form women leaders, enables our students to do good and to become leaders. And one thing we've learned through social science research, through scientific research on the brain, is that increasingly students learn through example, through touching things, through seeing things. And so today's panel, we have 4 outstanding women leaders who have shaped conversation in media, and through their role as activists and media individuals have helped to sort of change their worlds, change our worlds. I'm going to do a very brief introduction, and then we'll start with some of the questions at hand, and I'll just start at the very end. We have at the very end Maria Cristina Frias. She is a board member and a columnist for Folha de São Paulo, which since 1986 has had the largest circulation among all the major Brazilian newspapers. She writes an influential daily column entitled Open Market, in which she deals with issues of macroeconomics, finance, and enterprise generally. Her newspaper has been called, in some circles, the newspaper for the middle class because it deals with issues in a realistic and a questioning way. Also of note, Cristina participated in the 5th annual Global Symposium that was held in São Paulo, Brazil in 2013. Welcome. Next to Cristina is Robin Morgan. Robin's had a long history as an activist, anti-war activist and feminist. Robin oversaw the progression of Ms. Magazine as its editor-in-chief from the period 1989 to 1994. She saw it grow into a bi-monthly publication and an international publication that became a force, not just for women's issues, but for social issues and political issues across the globe. Her book, Sisterhood is Powerful, was named by the New York Public Library as one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century. She's a novelist, an essayist, a poet. She continues to be a prolific writer and a prolific force for change, and we welcome her here today. Sitting next to Robin is Mamphela Ramphele, no stranger to Barnard College. In 1991, Ramphele received the Barnard College Medal of Distinction and addressed our commencement exercises, the seniors in our commencement exercises that year. Dr. Ramphele's career has spanned domains. She has been a prominent South African anti-apartheid, a medical doctor, community development activist, a researcher, and an author. Among her many distinctions, she was managing director of the World Bank and also vice chancellor at the University of Cape Town, the first black woman to hold that position in South Africa. Mamphela participated in the 3rd annual Global Symposium, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, so we are welcoming her back as well. And then finally is, immediately to my right, is Gillian Tett. Gillian Tett is a social anthropologist. She has her PhD from Cambridge University, but she is currently writing, spent her career writing for the Financial Times. She is the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Among her many distinctions, Gillian was named Columnist of the Year last year by the British Press, 2014. So as I had the pleasure to review the biographies of these 4 fabulous women, I found myself wanting to know more. So I'm going to start the questioning, asking each of you in about 2 minutes to tell us more about yourselves. And I saw 3 common threads. These 4 women come from very different places, have done very different things, but 3 common threads. 1, a voracious capacity to learn. I'm going to call it curiosity. 2nd, a voracious tenacity to push ahead. Call it grit or perseverance. And finally, and really importantly, the flexibility to reinvent themselves, to change direction. So I personally want to learn more. So I ask you as your first question, divert a little bit from the script and tell us what path got you here, focusing, if you will, on the importance of learning, on the importance of pushing, and then finally on reinvention. And I think that we agreed last night, right, that Robin would go first.
Yes, ma'am. Before I say anything, I really do need to start with thanking you for moderating today and with thanking the organizers. Anyone who's been an organizer knows that to organize something as vast and complex as this symposium, much less the symposia, have to be either a masochist or a heroine or a combination of the two. And the organizers, I'm sure, haven't had a chance to wash their hair in 6 weeks. And most especially the wonderful fellows, we have to think of another word for them, who have been guiding us and leading us through this conference. And most of all, the magic, amazing Energizer Bunny, who is Deborah Spar. So thank you. Because this is bloody fantastic. Well, how we got it was grit, curiosity, and reinvention. Yes to all 3. I'm done. In a personal way, yes, most certainly. Curiosity, I think, the thirst to hear and see and be seen and heard, which women mostly aren't around the planet, is the core. In my case, I started as a writer. That's been the rock of everything. But I became involved as a political activist when I was very young, in my late teens, in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, but primarily in civil rights and voter registration, et cetera. And that's where I cut my political eye teeth. But in the new left, the so-called new left, the old left, the north and the south left, all lefts, all rights, all middles, it turned out that for women, not so much. We thought we were marching into a brave, new, wonderful world of the revolution, and we discovered we were getting bursitis from, endless churning of then mimeograph machines. We were making coffee, but not making policy. And so this wave of the radical wing of the women's movement was born, and I was part of that. Meanwhile, there were more reformist groups like National Organization for Women, et cetera, forming. And then flash forward 40 years, and I haven't washed my hair in 40 years, so that's... but the grit, or what I would also call audacity, which we were talking about yesterday in terms of leadership, is the sustaining of it. This year, the Women's Media Center, of which I'm a co-founder with Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem, will celebrate its 10th year. This year, the Sisterhood is Global Institute, with which I'm a co-founder with the late Simone de Beauvoir and women from 80 countries in the global south, will celebrate its 30th year. It is either, I'm never sure of this, so the oldest or one of the, to be on the safe side, international NGOs in existence. Sustaining, which is less glamorous. It's hard enough to found something, as every woman here who has founded or tried to found something knows. But to sustain, when it's less, that's the taking out the garbage part of the revolution. When people have said, good, you're in existence, fine, and you still lack funding and you lack a place to be, and everybody thinks you have both of those, so they come with their needs. I see heads immediately nodding in recognition. That's the hard part, sustaining the vision. And that's where other women come in, especially. Certainly at the founding of things, and certainly in terms of the curiosity aspect. But in terms of the grit, you cannot do it alone because you will go stark, raving bananas. And everything that is set up in patriarchy to make you go stark, raving bananas will come into play against you. This is something that you and I have been discussing a whole lot, because she is the original sustainer and keeping on, keeping on. And then the reinvention of the self, it seems to me, is absolutely paramount. Because if you fall in love with yourself at any one stage and don't cast that skin and be open to developing new ones, then you're stultified. You become, let me put it this way, if I were to summarize the patriarchy in one word, it would be compartmentalization. Siphon people off into categories by age, by race, by gender, by class, carve up the earth into borders. Chernobyl and acid rain don't care that, oh, I'm drifting over the wrong country now. They just drift. The same opposite is true in terms of feminism. If I had to characterize the energy of feminist thought and action in one word, it would be connectivity. The electricity that buzzes across making the connections, seeing the similarities, respecting the differences, what was discussed this morning as differences in individual cultures, of course. But where women are concerned, I like to think of it as it's the same plot, but with different settings and costumes. Where media is concerned, you don't have a representative democracy, nor can you fight for one unless you have a representative media. And we have a situation where around the world, when media is not state-controlled, which is bad enough, world media is now basically controlled by 6 to 8 corporations, all of which are in the hands of pale males. Yes, this is not a good thing, demonstrably, for most of the people on the planet, because the control of information is, in effect, the control of power. So the Women's Media Center was founded 10 years ago because Gloria and Jane and I were tired of throwing our house slippers at the television set and got very cranky of yelling at the New York Times and other newspapers as we turned the pages, and decided to do something about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but this is The Status of Women in the U.S. Media 2014. You can get it for free by going to womensmediacenter.com, center spelled the American way, ER, and downloading it. But it will make your hair stand straight on end, which is a very chic, punky look. But it basically, white males control and are evident in bylines, coverage, films, production, money, newspapers, newsrooms, and subject matter. Talking heads on Sunday talk shows throughout. 64% of the media in this country is controlled by pale males.
Okay, Robin, we're going to talk about the role of women in media as our next question. So hold that thought, if you will.
Well, then I'm done. I've babbled on enough.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cristina, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Good morning. I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here amongst distinguished guests. And, as we are among students, I'd like to go a little back to the time when I was a student. And I met some amazing students here last night. I was really very well impressed by their skills, especially their communication skills. They're really very, very good, those girls. Congratulations for the work you've been doing here in the college. But when I was a student, I was very much interested in education and psychology and philosophy. When I was a teenager, as a Brazilian, a developing country, I acted, even I was a teenager, I acted as a volunteer in a poor school at the countryside. So I was very, really at that time of our lives that we think what I'm going to do and what kind of contribution I'm going to give to my country. So I began in this field. I studied education psychology. But when I was on my third year at college, I had to do a report video. And the teacher found that I had skills to work in a television, and they were hiring people there. I didn't want to go to the media sector because my family was very connected to the sector, and I wanted to have a different script. But sometime after that, I was I was not very happy with the studies in psychology, and I said, why not to try, maybe in television? Because my family was much more connected to the press, not in television. And then I started like that, and worked as a national TV reporter, and as a commentator on economics, because I had post-graduation in this area. And later I went to the newspaper. Now I am a member of the board of one of the biggest media conglomerates in São Paulo, in Brazil. And also I'm working as a columnist. I think it's very interesting to be in both sides, and this is not very common, not only in Brazil, but even in developed countries. It's a very good and I think a useful experience. I don't want to be very long, to go so long.
Thank you. Mamphela.
Well, I come from a part of the world which has everything going for it to be a success. But somehow we are underperforming our potential. So curiosity, yes, I've always been curious about why a beautiful country like mine is not creating the opportunities for everyone to be as great as they could be. But I have to ascribe my curiosity to the benefit of being brought up by powerful women. My grandmothers on both sides and my mother were formidable women. They were not called feminists, but they were very clear about their dignity and the role that they could play. So that gave me the courage to know that I can be whom I want to become. And this in a country which had no time for black people, let alone a black woman. So I was really at the bottom of the rung, but refused to allow that. And so that then sets the tone for the tenacity, the grit. There was no other way of succeeding in South Africa except to be really tough about knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, and playing to your strength. And I was fortunate to be part of a group of students at the University of Natal that was influenced, interestingly, by the Black Power movement in this country. And so we got up and said, we are not non-whites. Imagine being called non-white, non-European in Africa. I mean, can you imagine someone coming and calling Americans non-Indians? You'll be shot out of here. But it was fine. In South Africa, we could be called non-whites. And people, including Mandela, said, we the non-white people of South Africa. He said, absolutely not. So it is in challenging convention as young students. And then, of course, I discovered, oh, my fellow comrades don't talk about women. I said, sorry, I'm black and proud, and I'm a woman and proud. And so we had to have the woman's voice come in not as an add-on, but as an integral part of consciousness. And it is that consciousness that sustains you through thick and thin. Because you can't one day be proud and the following day allow humiliation to be the nature of your environment. And that also allows one to enter into different domains, not because you fall in love with that domain. I was an accidental medical doctor, and I worked as an activist health worker for 14 years, but I changed and became an anthropologist, and I changed and became a vice chancellor, and I changed, I went to the world. All that doesn't mean that you suddenly wake up and you take on another skin. It's all in us, the power to be that which we can become. But it's risky. Now you take those risks and you move ahead. Like I took the risk in 2012 to say, my country is going in the wrong direction. Can we have a different politics? Lo and behold, yes, we could. Yes, people were excited, but they didn't have the guts. So you come up and you don't succeed in getting the kind of support that you thought you would get at the polls. You do what? You weep? No. You sit down and you pick up yourself and say, the country is not ready. What am I going to do to make sure that that consciousness that drove us in the 70s and 80s to win our freedom, we need a new consciousness in South Africa to make that freedom become a reality. And that's the business I'm in right now. Thank you.
Gillian.
Right. Well, thank you for having me along today, and thank you for your 3 wonderfully inspiring stories. And it's tough to go after that. I think you outlined having curiosity, flexibility, and resilience as being the 3 key ingredients. I noticed what you didn't say is confidence. And I think that's quite important, because if I have one message for everyone here in the audience today who are students, if you're sitting there not feeling very confident about where you want to go in life, and not feeling very confident about pushing yourself forward into a leadership position, don't worry. Because when I was your age, as a student, I was so chronically lacking in confidence that I didn't even have the courage to try and get onto the student newspaper. I was a very, very shy teenager, and I came from a background where girls were not supposed to do anything at all. I mean, my mother left school at 16, and I think her highest aspiration for me was to be what's called a chalet girl, someone who cooks in a skiing resort. True story. But I went to university, and as I say, I wasn't really confident enough to try and get onto the student paper. So I became an anthropologist, because the one thing I did have was a huge amount of curiosity. I wanted to travel the world quietly and try and understand other people. As an anthropologist, and I did both a BA and a PhD in anthropology, I went to first Pakistan, then Tibet, and then Tajikistan. And while I was out in Tajikistan, studying, in fact, women's issues, a very brutal civil war broke out, and a lot of people were killed, and my anthropology subject turned into history, tragically. So I started writing about what was going on, originally for human rights reasons, and then one thing led to another, and eventually I got picked up by the Financial Times as a freelance reporter, really initially a war reporter. And again, one thing led to another, and I discovered that I could write, and I got sent back to London to join the FT. And since the Financial Times, as you can guess from its name, Financial Times, writes a lot about money, they decided that what I should do to carry on working for them is go and learn something about finance. So they put me on the foreign exchange column. So I turn up in the market section of the FT, having spent some pretty harrowing years writing about small wars in the former Soviet Union. And my first thought was, what a waste of time. I mean, here I am, I want to be Martha Gellhorn, I want to be glamorous, I want to write about meaningful stuff, I want to write about wars and international politics, and I'm sitting here worrying about the dollar-yen rate. Wow. So I thought initially, well, you know what, okay, this is just the kind of stuff you have to do. I will just knuckle down, suck it up for 3 to 6 months, and then go back to doing something important. And after about a month, I suddenly had a blinding realization, and it's this: that if you want to understand the world around you and really understand how power works and what matters, and even why small wars happen and why terrible things happen, it's not enough just to understand the politics and the culture. You need to know where the money goes to. It's a bit like trying to understand a body. You need to know how the skin and the clothes and the outward signs actually look, but you need to know what's happening to the blood and the bones. And money is like the blood and the bones of the global body. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to sit down and learn this. And then I realized that actually, if I'd managed to learn Tajik or Tibetan or Urdu as an anthropologist, I could damn well learn, excuse my language, I could darn well learn the language of finance. Because certainly coming from my background, many girls tend to assume that money is kind of a male thing. But you know what? Anybody can learn it. And so I kind of had a vision that actually what I wanted to do with my life was find a way to connect up the two pillars of understanding how culture and politics works with understanding how finance works. Most people who look at finance and money only look at it in its own sake. They don't try and put it in context. And many people who, like me, are anthropologists, think that money is kind of dirty and you kind of ignore it. So I've tried to connect the dots. I've tried to bring them together. It sounds a lot clearer talking about it now in retrospect. I'm a great believer in that great Steve Jobs line from the 2005 commencement speech at Stanford, which is that you can't really join up the dots looking forward. You can only join them up looking back. Most successful people, hearing your stories, can tell a great tale today about how everything in their life connects up neatly now. I bet most of them had no idea when they were 18 about how it would connect up going forward. And yet if you have, if not the confidence and the courage to start wiggling and trying to, with tenacity and curiosity, move forward, then somehow life has an amazing way of bringing out the best in all of us.
Thank you all for those wonderful stories. We feel like we know you better now. And I want to pick up on something Robin said and pick up on the question from the last session. So you are all either producers or consumers of media, and both, in truth. And thinking about the media sector and the pale male model that you suggested, we have seen changes in the media sector and women's leadership. So my first question for you is, how has the growth of women's leadership, how's it gone, first of all? Is the sector really different? And how has it been influenced by the presence of women in the sector? How is reporting on economic issues, reporting on social issues, reporting on political issues changed, if at all? And then finally, to contextualize your answers, let's remember that over the last several decades, the notion of what constitutes media has changed dramatically due to the proliferation of new media sources, including social media of all kinds. So who can I ask to start the conversation around those topics? Robin went first for last time, so why don't we start with Cristina? Cristina?
Well, maybe I could start telling a bit how is the media sector in Brazil. Journalism is becoming more and more an occupation for women. Around 60 of the journalists, Brazilian journalists, are women, but they are not in the top positions. So in the newspaper where I work for, they have a better proportion in comparison of the rest of the press, but we still have only around 45% of the top positions with women. So it's really, we have a long way to go in this field. Well, thinking about being a columnist, I cover exclusive stories. I try to find new stories that haven't been shown, but we only have on the companies, and I cover the business affairs. We only have around 3% of the CEOs are women. So it's a reality we have to show, and even being a woman and trying to bring these subjects to the media, it's not an easy task. I also found that many of the CEOs are very low profile. And to have an example, I think Gillian the other day interviewed a CEO of a big company, and as I read, she's not very often on the press. So it's another difficulty we have on covering human stories. Let's start with this.
Gillian, you want to pick up with your experience at the Financial Times?
Yeah, well, okay, here's the good news, first of all. The FT is owned by Pearson, and until recently, for a very long time, the Pearson CEO was a woman. And in fact, the head of the FT group was also a woman. So there are senior women there. A great friend of mine, Zani Mindo-Beddoes, has just been appointed as the first female editor of The Economist magazine in the UK, and it looks like The Guardian's almost certainly going to get a woman editor as well. So there is some progress, but the reality is that women are still very underrepresented at the senior echelons of journalism. That is, unfortunately, a reflection, as you say, of what happens at the senior echelons of the corporate world and the political world. The challenge then for us is twofold. Firstly, how do we ensure that women get promoted inside newspapers and manage all the different juggles and stresses? For my own part, I spend quite a lot of time talking to young journalists, female journalists, and trying to persuade them to speak out, get their voice heard, to go into what I call the hard topics or the hard parts of journalism, not just to become books editor, but to try and become economics editor as well. It's very important. I try and persuade them that actually if they have to take a year or two out or slow down their career for a year or two when they have babies, to just keep going a bit. As somebody who did the juggle myself for a number of years, I believe very strongly in the idea that it's a bit like fitness. If you're having babies, if you can just keep working a bit, keep the muscles there, you'll have muscle memory about how to operate in an office and corporate environment when you go back. Even if you only jog once a week, at least keeps you fitter than if you don't jog at all. Even if you only work part-time, it's better than nothing. But it's tough, I know that. But the other thing is, I spend a lot of time thinking about how we portray women and quote women in the Financial Times. And it's a difficult one because I'm a passionate believer in the importance of having the demonstration effect. You know, a picture of a female CEO, a female central bank governor is very, very powerful for anybody picking up the paper in terms of changing cultural perceptions. So personally, I do my very best to try and make sure we get lots of women in power reflected in the paper. But at the same time, you can't just do it for tokenism. And a few years ago, I wrote a big cover magazine story about JP Morgan, which later turned into a book. And I had one woman out of six people, 5 male bankers, 1 female banker, in the magazine. And the woman in question, called Blythe Masters, was very attractive. And so they had photographs of all 6 of them, and guess who they put on the cover? Is that good? Is it bad? Was it sexism because they put an attractive blonde female on the cover who's a female banker? Or is it instead changing perceptions of what defines a banker these days? I mean, frankly, I don't have easy answers. It's something I'm grappling with. I know we probably get it wrong quite often, but I hope we get it right more often than we get it wrong, and we're certainly trying.
Thank you. Robin.
Yeah, well, a quickie report on the United States. The majority of folks in journalism school now are women. That's the good news. The bad news is they're not being hired when they come out into journalism. So the majority of those graduates are going into PR, which is a field worse than hell. At least, with all due respect to people in PR, at least if you aimed to be a journalist, to be in PR is a field worse than hell. But what I can do is share with you some of the approaches we've been trying to take to change this at the Women's Media Center, because we've been studying how do women affect the media then and make it different. One is the research that we've done and do every year, and we've now become the go-to place on statistics, working with people at the Annenberg Center, with people with the women's group at Sundance over the statistics in film, etc. So we know what the problem is. And there are a number of other initiatives, one of which we're very proud is the training program, the media training program, because there are an amazing number of women who run for and even sometimes win public office who are not media savvy in what is a very media sophisticated, perhaps even too much so, country. There also, even more importantly, are grassroots activists everywhere who are doing amazing things, these women, but are not media savvy. How do you hold a press conference? How do you write a press release? How do you handle an interview? How in an interview do you talk about what you want to talk about, never mind what the interviewer is asking? So we have a training program for these women. Then we have SheSource, which is hard to pronounce, but there you go. It's like a seashell ship, who shines, that one. But SheSource is a division where we have now the largest database of women experts in the world. So there is no more excuse for bookers on programs where you have talking heads discussing the latest issue of the day and so saying, well, we would, but we can't find qualified women. These are women experts on everything from A to Z. And sometimes the graduates of the training program become speakers listed with SheSource. Then we have the F-bomb, which is now subsumed into the Women's Media Center, which was started by a high school student who then went on to become a Barnard graduate, for very young, much younger feminists. Very young, I say, because I've reached a venerable age of 112. I'm basically as old as Barnard, I think. Certainly this morning. Then we also generate original content, so we don't only always criticize, but try to model what would a media that was representative read like, listen like, look like. So there's original essays that are features on the website, womensmediacenter.com. There's the radio program, WMC Live with Moi, which is now syndicated nationally and on iTunes in 110 countries. And that is a women's hour where the news issues as if women mattered. So all of those approaches and more that I don't want to have time to mention are ways of impacting on the media. But one way that we all can, certainly, is we live in the age of the internet. which has on the one hand changed everything and on the other hand not so much, because the sexism has transmuted itself and the racism right onto the internet, sometimes more virulently because the guys can sit there anonymously in their jammies eating Fritos and send out hate mail and threatening mail to women and people of color and so on. So how do we deal with that? Some of the most interesting feminist writing is right now online. And when older feminists, some of my generation, say, where are the young feminists? They just aren't looking in the right places. Because you're there, you're online, you're pissed off for all the right reasons. And some of the best feminist analysis and theory and writing and stories and passion is taking place online. But how to affect that and how to gain a comparable voice for that is very complex. The internet is really now our public square. And there are guys, usually in the 18 to 25-year-old demographic, the intensity period of high testosterone poisoning, where they don't want women in their public space, and they make it very, very clear they don't want women there. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, but it's incredibly not only inspiring, it's doable. And it's doable to get, if information is power, which it is, then to get that information out transforms everything. In terms of economic impact, and you're absolutely right, none of us were trained to think that we were even capable of grasping it. Certainly I was not. But for example, women's unpaid labor is the largest source of energy on the planet. Women don't, in most countries in the world especially, but not exclusively in the global south, women simply don't live under capitalism. We live under feudalism. And the United Nations system of national accounts reflects that. If you are in an economy that burns fossil fuel and hurts the planet, obviously, men mine coal, that's considered real work. It goes into the national accounts. When time comes for benefits and subsidiaries to go back, it goes back to those people. But in most countries of the global south, women gather fuel, they gather peat, they gather droppings, they gather wood for fuel. That does not count as labor. So it doesn't appear on the national accounts, nor do the benefits accrue back to them. This single piece of information, just as in the United States, if women were to get equal pay for equal work, would change the GDP, would do away with any fear of a recurring recession, would make all the difference. So the question is, how do we get that information out? And economics reporting, with the exception of 2 women, my sisters right here on this panel, is largely male.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mamphela, if I can just direct your comments, for 4 decades or so, your work has been so heavily covered by media. So as you reflect on the influence of media in your own sphere, can you talk a little bit about the trends that you see globally, the trends that you see in your own country of South Africa?
I'm so pleased that I'm with people who really have thought very carefully about what you report on, how you report on it, and the impact of it. Because I come from a continent which is oftentimes reflected as a basket case, Africa. And yet, over the last few years, there has been this new scramble for Africa. Africa, Africa on the rise, the lions on the prowl. But let's look at what that means, actually. What is counted in terms of Africa as one of the growing regions of the global economy, which is largely really stagnant? Is, again, extractive economics that is really being counted. Africa's great resources in terms of minerals, in terms of natural resources, and the human resources are being exploited, not in a sustainable way, but in a way that ultimately is going to leave our continent with more difficulties than we already have. And I come from a country which has been known to be having the largest reserves of minerals. And yet the people in whose areas these minerals are being mined are left poorer, more exposed to occupational diseases and others, and we don't have a focus on reporting on those issues. So when we talk about Africa on the rise, what is rising? And what about the unaccounted for contribution of women to food security in Africa, of women to the securing of the environment for the next generations? Women keep the seed, but we now have the international seeds that come in and wipe out the local, strong, resilient seeds. And we don't have a conversation in the media about those issues. So the measurement, the narrative of what constitutes progress or not is one that we need to actually interrogate. Because if we don't, we're going to repeat the mistakes of the first scramble for Africa with all its horrible history. Second, the narrative of progress in terms of gender equality. This morning we heard very powerful stories about how interventions are making a difference in the lives of women and in the lives of countries and nations across the globe. But the one issue which we haven't yet found a way of talking about is the toxic masculinity narrative. I'm a mother of 2 sons, and I know how negatively they are impacted by the traditional expectations of who they should be. And they didn't have fathers to show them an alternative, and so they had to default to the toxic masculinity narrative in our environment in South Africa. Despite us having the best constitution in terms of human rights and women's rights as being human rights, we have the highest violence against women and children that's recorded anywhere in the world. Why? Because the men are trapped in expectations of being providers and protectors, and they don't have the equipment. They are uneducated, they are unskilled, and the job market is spewing them out. And we need to talk about that. And we as women need, particularly women who are mothers like me, we have a vested interest in making sure that men are protected from this toxicity, so they can become the best that they can be. Their feminine side must be affirmed as well as their masculine side. Then we have that complementarity between men and women. The final issue really is about my country and precisely this contradiction between the Rainbow Nation, the country of Mandela. Everybody was wowed by that. But now we are stuck. We are stuck with the contradiction between that constitution and the lived reality. And that is where I believe the media can really be of immense help. South Africa is not just defined by Zuma and the corruption in the country. South Africa is also defined by strong women, by people and strong men who are doing extraordinary things. But we don't have in South Africa the support that we used to have at the time when we were fighting for freedom. Now we're fighting to consolidate freedom, but we don't get the support that we should get. And I believe that we need to think very carefully about how to have that global solidarity, not coming in peaks when there is a crisis, but also investing in sustaining democracy and gender equality in the globe. And that requires a much more subtle, complex narrative in media reporting about what's working, what's not working, and why, and how do we invest in civic education, in supporting young women and men to become the citizens of the globe that we now need. We need global citizens across the regions, and that's possible, but we need to find a way of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you all. So the word of the day is tenacity. There is some progress. We haven't gotten as far as we'd like. The media sector, like all our sectors, continue to progress slower than we all would like in the directions that we would like. And we all continue to struggle for voice. So I'm going to open it up now to questions. We have, yes, please. Please. And there's a mic that will come to you. If you could just wait for a minute. And if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elise Fitzands. I'm a very proud Barnard alum, a lawyer and a public health professional. I want to pick up on what Gillian said about childbearing and its impact on career. I don't usually talk about personal experience, but this time it's relevant. I was teaching in an Ivy League law school, and there was no maternity leave. And I think that what is important in what you were saying is not so much keeping that muscle of part-time work, but the people that push out women because of childbearing. And I think also, as you were saying about the narrative of the toxic male has to be discussed. The two words that I didn't hear discussed in Beijing at the original meeting and haven't heard this week at the Women's Commission discussion of the 20-year review, which I also attended in Geneva. The two words I haven't heard are motherhood and divorce. And from a European perspective, these have huge economic impacts on the life of women. Motherhood is increasingly unvalued. It would be nice to have equal pay for equal work if you had a paying job. If you're caretaking for children, if you're taking them to interview at schools, you're not going to be paid for that time. And it's not necessarily valued by anybody, no matter how important it is. So first of all, to actually have some value around that work. But then what they're discovering in Europe is that the impact of this is showing itself in what's predicted to be a new wave of the feminization of poverty, because the time taken for this has an economic cost, and women do not do the time of paid labor. So men will max out disproportionately on their pensions. You're nodding your head. I'm getting to a question, trust me. But this is something that I haven't heard discussed and therefore has to be brought to the table because it undercuts our ability to do anything effectively as a group, okay? The feminization of poverty that's expected is the men will max out disproportionately on their pensions and women will disproportionately not have large pensions. You will have a generation of grandfathers who can buy any toy the kid wants and grandmothers who may not be able to afford themselves. And so the question is, can we start a discourse somewhere in the economic discourse that, and in the media that it has this very activist young feminist crowd to address these taboo issues from the past generation, divorce and the undervaluing of motherhood. Thank you for the patience for a long question.
For me? Right.
I think so.
Well, as someone who has sadly been a single mother, and I wasn't expecting to be a single mother, but I am now a single mother of two wonderful daughters, and who is entirely financially responsible for the three of us. It's an issue which is, close to my heart. The reality is that for many women who are working mothers, it is tough, and yet I'm also profoundly grateful that I had the opportunity to have a career and to look after myself and my two daughters with dignity. I never for a millisecond take for granted the incredible freedoms we do have in the West, because working in a place like Tajikistan and Pakistan, I've seen what terrible realities many women today work through or live through. And although things are very tough here in the West sometimes, we should never, ever, ever forget that. And I say that with some passion, having seen what happened to the women of my age in Tajikistan during the war. I completely agree there needs to be a lot more debate about it. there definitely does, and it's something I try and push forward myself, and I'm sure Cristina does with her own columns. I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is, how many of you in the room have ever heard of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist? A few of you, okay. He's a French sociologist, brilliant man in my view, who basically argued the way that an elite stays in power is not merely by controlling the means of production, to be unfashionably Marxist, but by controlling the way that we think, or rather shaping the way we think. And what matters in that respect is not just what we talk about in public, but what we don't talk about. Social silences are absolutely key. And an ability to join up the silos, to join up the dots, is part of that pattern of social silences. I read that argument when I was a student. It made a profound impact on me. It was core to my work as an anthropologist. In fact, it's core to a book that I'm publishing later this year. But it's very much how I define my role, and if you like, my public service mission as a journalist, is to not merely try and join up the dots of a world that's very fragmented, but above all else, to try and shed light on social silences, because the social silences is the way that the power structure stays in place. And I'd simply argue that talking about something like the feminization of poverty is one of the social silences that it's really beholden on us as journalists to try and talk about.
I would just add one thing. I agree completely, but one way to try to systemically address this is to pressure your Congress people, who will wake up and say, what are you even talking about? And you'll have to educate them about the system of national accounts. It starts in the delivery room if, let's say, she is lucky enough to get to a delivery room. Let's say she is in New York City, privileged, terrific. In the delivery room, the doctor is considered productive, the nurses, the anesthesiologist, if there is one, the aides, they're all doing productive labor. The woman who is giving birth is non-productive. She is literally, she's just in labor, but she is considered non-productive. So going back to Marx and Engels, the heart of this is not the means of production. It's the means of reproduction, which in turn produces the damn labor force to begin with, without which can do nothing. So it's a matter of, if we're trying to not just tweak the coverage so you do more about motherhood and the situation of motherhood in a world that claims to be sentimental about it, but actually does not support it in any way. The same in terms of divorce. But you're trying to systemically change it, which is what Mamphela and I have been trying to talk about a lot with each other and here, to get to the real thing instead of band-aiding all around it. The national accounts are absolutely imperative because they make women's unpaid labor, whether it's gardening, childcare, childbirth, cooking, the millions of things that she does that are considered, she doesn't work, she's just a housewife. If those were to appear on the national accounts, you have a whole new bag.
Thank you. Another question? Yes. Over there, please.
Hi, my name is Yachao Wen. I'm actually a current Barnard student. I'm a senior, and I'm an international student. I'm from Beijing, China. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for all of you coming here today to exchange your ideas. And I want to say special thanks to Gillian, because actually I am going to work for a finance firm upon graduation. I'll work for Moody's. And as a student from a liberal arts college, I was not so confident about my finance technical skills, but now I just feel more comfortable entering the financial world as an international woman. And my question is that, so recently the publishing industry is actually declining. So what you are facing is that you have to deal with maybe a little bit the worry about the industry, and at the same time, you need to use that vehicle to promote the issues such as the gender equality issue. So do you see that is a challenge, or do you see that you can just transfer the attention to social media or to like electronic newspapers to solve that problem? Thank you.
Is that a question for me? Or, yeah, I mean,
For the people, the column, maybe Cristina, Robin, and Gillian. But maybe you as well.
well, I can jump in quickly if you want.
Sure.
Firstly, to say, well done for having the courage to go into finance and economics. I say, if I can go into it from being an anthropologist, you can definitely go into it from almost anywhere. So, good luck. I was actually a set designer and art student before that, so not very numerate. Yes, the media is under pressure and we're under challenges. Yes, it's tough to promote a credible, thoughtful conversation in a world of instant sound bites. What drives me in terms of my dream and my vision is very much that at a time when so much of the media is driven by short sound bites and so much is fragmented and so many people live in intellectual ghettos and little silos, I happen to believe that in some ways, perversely, the worse the world around us gets in that direction, or the more it moves in that direction, the more that there is actually still some demand for thoughtful conversation and a thoughtful way to join up the dots and actually provide vision in this very noisy, short-termist world. It's a bit like saying that actually the onset of home videos and DVDs didn't kill the cinema. It actually made people who were sometimes discerning, sometimes just wanting a social experience, keep going to the cinema, but for slightly different reasons. And I happen to believe that there absolutely is still a need for credible, thoughtful media in today's world. I think many people instinctively feel, amid the cacophony of Twitter and all the kind of cable shows, that they need something more. We can't just live off cookies. We need some good, healthy food as well, if you like, for the mind. And that's what drives me. And I just say that if you are a student, think about the media you consume. Think about whether you're actually paying for it or not. Because things that are free, guess what, tend not to be so valuable. And think about trying to actually maintain a broad mind and not just get stuck in one social or intellectual ghetto, but try to actually actively engage in thoughtful media, not just because it might actually pay my salary, that's important, or all of our salaries, but because actually it helps your mind and it helps society more broadly.
I would just say that in a time of transformation, culture gets to reinvent itself too, not just individuals. And certainly we live in in the age of information. It has its ironies because the institutions that have brought us that information, or haven't, are changing or disappearing. But I couldn't agree more that doesn't mean the need isn't still there, the thirst isn't still there, and there will always be ways in the human species of answering that need. So you as an individual, in fact, all the wonderful young women who are here today and on this campus, don't let anything stop you. Don't let all the naysaying voices outside, and especially the ones inside that have been planted there and grow, stop you in the slightest. You owe us, who have gone before, nothing really. I mean, we've tried our best, but gratitude is not the point. And the truth is, we didn't do it for you. We did it for ourselves. We did it because we reached a point of insult so intolerable that we were going to move no matter what. So let me free you of, guilt or having to be nice. If you want to be nice, that's lovely. But you don't have to be nice. And you owe us nothing, but you owe yourselves and each other everything. You're equipped to go out and change the world and save it and carry yourself as someone who will, because if you do, you will. That's what you're going to do.
Maybe I could just add that our work is about credible information. It's not only it's not paper. So it can be, and if it's by digital, in the digital way, it's easier because we don't have the expenses on paper, that it's a commodity, it's an expensive one. So it can be by digital. So if there is still interest in credible information, there will be interest on our work, I believe.
I think we may have a question from social media.
That's me over here.
Great, thank
so
you.
a question from Stephanie Brown via Twitter. What can we as consumers of media do to promote women's participation as professionals in the field?
What can we do to promote women's participation
In the field as consumers?
in the field? As consumers of media, what can we do to promote women's participation in the media sector?
Yes.
Well, you can write cranky letters. And you can set up hashtags whenever there is something in the media that you know has completely erased the female half of humanity, and start those hashtags vibrating, and you'd be very interested in how many suddenly people sign on. Yes, and what's more, he didn't say, and what's more, they didn't cover, and what's more, what about the, if you uncork the bottle? Yeah, I mean, we've all experienced that. If you write the column that has given you sweaty palms to actually write, you think, oh, this is really, I'm going to do me in. But you get it out there and you get it said, you will find you're not alone. There are a whole lot of people out there saying, oh, you too, I'm not crazy. That's what you want to tap into, that energy.
I would just say that right now in the media world, we are in an absolutely unprecedented moment, because never before in history have the producers of media been able to know what the consumers were reading and how they were actually interacting with it. I mean, when I joined the FT almost 20 years ago, though I haven't worked at the FT continuously since then, we'd produce a paper, we'd put it out in the streets when it was a paper, and we kind of guessed or hoped that people read it. If they bought it, we kind of assumed they read it, or else it turned into fish and chip paper. But we had no way of knowing exactly which piece we were reading and how and why. Today, sitting on the desk in the New York office, we have little gizmos on machines that tell us exactly which articles are being read, how and why. Raises big questions about the degree to which we edit by the numbers, because we don't for the most part. But it does mean that actually consumers, meaning all of you, have an ability to make yourself known through, if not your feet, then your mouse pads on your mobile phones. I mean, if you actually start doing, as you say, hashtags, following people, making comments, reading stuff, circulating it, we see that. And just as big, consumer companies actually track media and then track their sales of their products and respond, the media companies will also produce stuff that they think that consumers are reading and following and engaging with, and that, in effect, means you lot.
Can I just go back to a question you asked me, which I didn't respond to earlier on, which is about the portrayal of women in the media, because I want to come back to this issue of increased participation of women. That if you have a life like mine, where you are always someone who's going across boundaries and you are seen as a transgressor in traditional terms, you get the support and the kudos from certain people, and a lot of young people, that's what keeps me going, are inspired by it. But you also frighten the establishment, and the establishment is vicious. And it uses not just men to attract women who are too loud, too self-confident, and too, who are out there, but also women who fall into the trap of attacking other women who are in a position of being in the public space. And I'll give you an example. After the experience with the political party Ahang, there was a huge fallout, obviously. But the point is, the women, or a woman who's the editor of the City Press, doesn't talk about what's happened in the country in terms of the positive contribution that this new language that was introduced into politics was about. Doesn't talk about the fact that the governing party continues to do all of the things that are undermining our future, but decides to write a column on me to say, Madam, please pay out. And when you look at it, it's about putting the monkey of anyone who's been in a political party and campaign know the expensive nature of it. In your country, it's worse here in the US, but even in developing countries, it's a very expensive proposition. And I put a lot of my own personal time, money, and energy into it. But still, this was the demand. Why? Because I'm a woman, I must take care of those who now don't have jobs because the party didn't do as well as we thought. But she doesn't say that of any other political leader who are all men. But to me, yes, Madam, pay up. So I also think that part of the increasing the participation of women in the media has to be about women who are excluded. When we talk about social media, the hashtags, when you go to the communities I work with in Kayalicha or in rural areas, they won't be able to do the hashtag. But there are ways in which we can document the lives of those women. We can show what they are doing to do this work which is unpaid and or to hold communities and families together. And they can see themselves on the media through YouTube or whatever. So we need to also be bolder in experimenting with the use of the social media to include those who are currently excluded.
So the title of the Global Symposium is Women Changing the World. We have 4 women, powerful women, who have, for their part, done their contribution to changing the world. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here on the panel today. I've enjoyed it immensely. I wish there was more time, but alas, there is not more time. So I want to thank Cristina, Robin, Mamphela, and Gillian. Please, let's give a thank you to them for their participation. Wonderful, and just 2 brief announcements. One is that Gillian Tett's office has provided free copies of the Financial Times to every participant. So if you are interested, pick up that Financial Times and start reading about financial issues. We need more of you. And the second announcement is that the next session will begin at 2 o'clock following lunch. We ask that if you have your badges, please continue to wear them. You've already registered. It will help identify you as you come into the 2 o'clock session. Thank you all.